Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into something totally fascinating and taking on a pretty monumental task, demystifying Karl Marx's Kapital Volume II. Now, while Volume 1 gets all the fame for its critique of the factory floor and the origins of profit, Volume 2 is an entirely different beast. This is where we actually pop the hood to look at the mechanical engine of capitalism itself. We're going to examine how capital circulates, how it regenerates, and how this entire society-wide economic machine manages to keep running day after day.
At the very heart of this source material is a core mystery that Volume 2 is trying to solve. Think about it for a second. How does money seemingly magically create more money? A business owner throws a pile of cash into an enterprise, a bunch of activity happens, and then, eventually, a larger pile of cash pops out the other end. What is the actual, literal mechanism that makes this expansion possible? That is exactly what we're going to unpack today.
But before we get to the math, get this. There's a really incredible piece of history behind this text. Karl Marx actually died before Volume 2 was published, so it's left to his longtime collaborator, Friedrich Engels, to piece this incredibly complex theory together from Marx's extremely messy draft notebooks. Engels faced a monumental task. He's literally wading through colloquialisms, jokes, and Marx's famously atrocious handwriting so bad that even Marx couldn't always read it. Engels had to somehow stitch together a coherent economic theory from these raw, unpolished thoughts. So, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. Decoding Capital Volume 2. 2. The circuit of capital. 3. Three forms of capital. 4. The reproduction process. And finally, 5. Aggregate social capital. Let's get right into it. Kicking things off with Section 1, Decoding Capital's Volume 2. Right off the bat, we've got to totally rewire how we define a word we use literally every single day. According to the text, capital is not just a giant pile of gold locked in a vault somewhere. It isn't a static object at all. Instead, capital is a dynamic, continuous process of movement and circulation. To actually be capital, it must flow. A hoard of money doing nothing is just a hoard. It only becomes capital when it is thrown into this moving fluid of the economic machine. Which brings us nicely to Section 2, the circuit of capital.
The source text uses a very specific formula to describe this cycle. M to C, then P, then C prime to M prime. Kind of an alphabet soup, right? Let's break that down into plain English. Step 1. You start with money, or M, and you use it to buy commodities, or C. Specifically, you're buying labor power and the means of production, like raw materials and machinery. Step 2. Production happens. This is P. Your workers use the machinery and materials to create entirely new commodities. Step 3. You now have a totally new set of commodities, which Marx calls C prime. You take these to the market, sell them, and you get back more money, or M prime.
Let's ground this abstract math with a real, concrete example straight from the text, a spinning mill. In the first phase of our circuit, an industrialist advances 422 pounds. That cash basically vanishes, transforming into physical means of production. We're talking cotton, the wear and tear of spindles, and the wages for the spinners. Out of that productive engine comes 10,000 pounds of freshly spun yarn.
And here is where the circuit beautifully completes itself. Those 10,000 pounds of yarn are taken to the market and sold for 500 pounds. So, that original 422 successfully navigated the entire circuit and returned as 500. We just generated an excess value of 78 pounds.
Okay, but where does that extra 78 pounds actually come from? The text defines this excess as surplus value. According to this economic theory, surplus value is essentially gratuitous, unpaid labor performed by the worker. The capitalist buys the worker's time for a set wage, but the worker ends up producing more value during that time than what they were actually paid for. This excess value, which costs the capitalist absolutely no equivalent return, is the secret sauce. That's the source of that magical expansion from 422 to 500. Moving right along to Section 3, three forms of capital.
As capital moves through that M to M prime cycle we just talked about, it constantly shapeshifts. First, it's money capital. Then it physically morphs into productive capital, the factory, the machines, the labor. Finally, it turns into commodity capital, the finished goods just waiting to be sold. The massive takeaway here from the source is that these are not independent industries. They are just special functional forms that industrial capital assumes, one right after the other. It's exactly like water freezing into ice and then boiling into steam.
And this is absolutely crucial. Capital is like blood in a living body. It has to keep flowing. If it stops in phase 1, it's just a dead hoard of cash. If it jams up in the productive phase, you've got idle machines and unemployed workers. And if it stops at the end, you get mountains of unsold goods clogging up the market. The entire survival of the investment relies entirely on a continuous, uninterrupted flow.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, the reproduction process.
For this whole system to actually persist over time, the circuit can't just happen once. It has to reproduce. The text outlines 2 ways this happens. The first is simple reproduction. This is where our capitalist takes that extra 78 pounds of surplus value and entirely consumes it unproductively, spending it on luxury goods or personal living expenses. The factory keeps running, sure, but on the exact same scale. Then we have accumulation. This is the game changer. Here, the surplus is reinvested back into the business to buy more machines and hire more workers. Accumulation is the literal engine of capitalist growth.
Now the author actually takes a moment in Volume 2 to critique earlier economic heavyweights, specifically Adam Smith, to show how his theory builds on the past. Smith basically argued that the total value of a commodity neatly divides itself into 2 parts, wages for the worker and profits for the capitalist. But the text calls out a massive blind spot in Smith's theory. Marx argues that Smith completely forgot about constant capital. Yeah, the worker produces value that covers their wages. And yes, they produce surplus value for profit. But what about the raw materials? What about the machinery that gets worn down in the process? The value of that constant capital is preserved and transferred directly into the new product. Grasping that this old value is continually passing into the new product is vital for understanding how the entire system reproduces itself without having to constantly start from scratch.
Let's zoom out for our final section, Section 5, Aggregate Social Capital.
So we need to take a macro view. How do millions of these tiny individual circuits interlock across an entire society? To visualize how social capital reproduces itself, the text divides the whole global economy into 2 massive departments. Department I produces the means of production, think coal, industrial machinery, and oil. Department 2 produces articles of consumption, food, clothing, everyday necessities. Basically, every business on Earth falls roughly into one of these 2 buckets.
Now, for the global machine to actually work, these 2 departments have to interact in a highly specific dance. The workers who build the heavy tractors in Department I can't eat tractors, right? They must use their wages to buy food and clothes from Department 2. And on the flip side, the capitalists making clothes in Department 2 are eventually going to need to replace their worn-out sewing machines, so they have to buy from Department I.
And that brings us to the ultimate, brilliant takeaway of Volume 2. One capitalist's finished product, their commodity capital, is quite literally another capitalist's starting raw material, their productive capital. The survival of this entire system relies on a perfectly balanced, deeply interlocking web of buyers and sellers. If Department I pumps out too much steel or Department 2 can't sell enough shirts, the whole interlocking mechanism jams.
Which leaves us with a fascinating and honestly somewhat precarious final thought. We've seen the capital is this continuous process, a flow that has to constantly expand and change forms, relying on a vast, fragile web of societal exchange. So, what happens when that web tears? What actually happens when commodities pile up and the circuit breaks? That tension is baked right into the machine, and it's a question that continues to drive economic study today. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning how the machine works.